A very warm welcome to all of you. Today, in this NTPL course on migration, mobilities and development, we are going to take on the concept of theorizing migration in anthropology. So, this lecture, Theorizing Migration in Anthropology, is based on Caroline Brettell's chapter in the book Migration Theory, Talking Across Disciplines. Now, as you know, some of you who might be students of anthropology, anthropology has been described as the most scientific of the humanistic fields and the most humanistic of the sciences, right? So, what Brettell does is she argues that, as anthropologists, they formulate their own understanding and interpretations of the meanings and experiences of migration. They should also, in particular, reach out to other disciplines, sociology, geography, political science, and other interdisciplinary fields like cultural studies, for example, for ideas and concepts to work with and write against or nuance while working on migration. So, fundamentally, Brettell begins the chapter. The chapter starts when she talks about noted cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, right? Margaret Mead's work nearly 100 years ago in the 1920s, in the late 1920s, while conducting fieldwork in New Guinea, which is a Pacific island in Oceania. Margaret Mead noted that boys spent about 2 to 7 years away from the village working for the white man, and it was seen as a sense of adventure. Every boy looked forward to such migration. And similarly, in another fieldwork in 1933, in the village where she was living, she found that more than 50% of the young boys were migrants, right? And yet, ethnographic descriptions of life in New Guinea largely portrays them as discrete, timeless cultures unaffected by the outside world. So, what does that tell us? That tells us that, there's generally been a sedentary bias in anthropology. And so migration wasn't really studied much, one didn't shift the gaze to migration. And by the time you come to the 1950s and 1960s, this changed. Theorizing migration became possible in anthropology, and Africa, Oceania, Latin America, the Caribbean, these were all then, they became sites of anthropological work. And also, why is that? Because this is a time empirically when rural-urban migration became prevalent in the global south. So you had the areas of peasant studies, areas of urban anthropology that specifically studied migration, shifted their gaze to migration. And since the 1970s, migration studies within anthropology, Brettell tells us, has expanded significantly. We have an international migration stream which is studied. Then there's also internal migration, rural-urban migration is studied. And migration is also studied from a historical perspective in anthropology, right? So, now when it comes to theorizing migration in anthropology, as we discussed in one of our early classes on talking across disciplines, migration studies, we know that every discipline is shaped by its own epistemology, which generates a specific set of questions, and that's true for anthropology too. So, in anthropology, you largely have articulation between the place when a migrant, from where a migrant originates, and the place or places to which he or she moves, right? So, you have a source and you have a destination, and the migrant could have moved several places in between, right? And then some of the questions that anthropology is concerned with, Brettell tells us, is how is it that people in local places respond to global processes? Then there are questions, issues of cultural change, forms of social organization that are characteristic of both the migration process and the immigrant community. And then, of course, anthropology focuses a lot on migrant subjectivities, their identities, and so on, right? So, after this, Brettell takes us through various typologies of mobility, right? And she draws our attention to migrant typologies and what meanings they might have. So, since its beginning, anthropology has been comparative and cross-cultural, and therefore it has relied on typologies as a way to theorize similarity and difference. And largely, the areas of study have been, broad areas of study in anthropology have been kinship and marriage systems, forms of religious behavior and belief, types of economic exchange, types of political organization. And and then, you can have various kinds of migration or migrant typology. So, for instance, these could be short-term or long-term migration, permanent or temporary migration, masculinized or feminized migration streams. You can also have labor migration, highly skilled migration, entrepreneurial migration. So, these are, some of the typologies which you may have heard, you may be familiar with, and we're also going to look at them as we move on. The other point is that different typologies then have different policies, right? If you were to look at it from the perspective of the state and public policy, you would know that migration policies for agricultural workers or construction workers in developed countries are very different from highly skilled migrant visas for those who are on H-1B visas, for entrepreneurs, and so on. So then, migrant typologies are, of course, analytical frames for us to understand various types of migration, but they also are very, very closely intertwined with the state and state policies and so on. So, for Melch, there are two kinds of immigrants. One is those who intend their departure to be permanent, and then there are others who intend for it to be temporary, right? So, here now what we are doing is we are looking at the typology of return migration per se. And so, therefore, when we look at return migration, it could be amongst immigrants who intend to come back, right? Whose intention to migrate is temporary. Now, why is it that this category exists? How can we understand return migrants, right? So, one of the main reasons is that there are strong family ties, right? So, rather than economic factors that pull you a destination, there are strong family ties which are a major incentive for return. Now, we also know that, return migration often can be a part of an initial migration strategy. You could have migrants wanting to return, but they continue to postpone it, right, because of some life goal that they have, and so on and so forth. And within this, the category of sojourner becomes very important. Now, in a 1951 article in the American Journal of Sociology, the sojourner is defined as such. So, who is a sojourner? What is a sojourner? So, a sojourner is treated as a deviant type of sociological form of the stranger, one who clings to the cultural heritage of his own ethnic group and tends to live in isolation, hindering his assimilation to the society in which he resides, now often for many years. So, then the sojourn is conceived by the sojourner as a job which he is able to finish in the shortest time possible. And now that job could be, as an alternative, to end, he travels back to his homeland a few times and then he comes back, and he travels and he comes back, right? And now you could sojourn for a specific reason. You could, you could have like a goal of saving up money to buy a car, to buy a house, to pay for your children's education, and you do a frequent back and forth between the source and destination, between the homeland and your place of immigration, right? So, now, Caroline Brettel uses the examples of Chinese, Brazilian, Mexicans in the US being a sojourner. You go there, you have some life goal, which is economic, it could be financial, you finish that life goal and you come back. Similarly, in the context of India, we have internal migrants. You have, say for instance, Bihari migrants in Delhi, Oriya migrants in Hyderabad. All of them come for a particular period of time and then eventually go back, right? So, there is one important type of migration which is return migration, right? And then There's also an unsettling dimension of return migration. There's pain, there's disorientation, there is, there's a lot of negative connotations associated with return migration. You can also have positive connotations like being reunited with your family, actually being back home, and so on and so forth, right? This is a social, mature man holding substantial personal wealth, supporting dependents and clients, right? So, return migration, as you can see, is a very important component of migration, very important typology of migrants that, and anthropologists also, much of their work also focuses on the return, right? And so even return migration is not permanent. You can imagine return migrants coming back and then remigrating again. So you could have a change of intentions after migrating back after return migration and migrate again, right? The other thing we need to understand is that migration typologies also have, they can have ethic dimension or they can have emic dimension. What do we mean by ethic dimensions? Ethic dimensions are dimensions of outsiders, how somebody on the outside is perceiving that migration. Whereas emic dimensions generally mean insider dimensions, right? So, emic dimension could be, one component of emic dimension could be migrants' lived experience of their own migration, right? So, the point being that typologies that capture different strategies, typologies capture different strategies such as ethic and emic dimensions, right? Now, much of the early work on migration within anthropology was influenced by modernization theory, right? And modernization theories had a bipolar framework of sending areas, receiving areas, push, pull, city versus the country or the village as two distinct ways of life, right? And so economic factors versus bright lights of the city. So modernization theory also rests on the assumption that labor is abundant, ready to move, willing to move, and capital is scarce, right? And eventually, one of the goals of modernization theory or the end game of modernization theory is that ultimately the differences between rural and agrarian and urban and industrial areas will eliminate. So there will be a convergence. Development is associated with the convergence of living standards, incomes between rural and urban areas, between agriculture and industrial societies, and so on, right? And as you know, in the Lewis model that we studied in an earlier class, in modernization theory, migration is a one-way unilateral street. There is no scope of return migration. However, we saw in the previous slide how return migration is such an important and fundamental component typology of migration, right? But early on in the initial years, much of the work was, globally done in the perspective of this modernization theory, right? And the other component of modernization theory is Rostow's stages of growth theory, right? As we saw, all countries are expected to experience development in the same stages, right? And but we know empirically that's not been valid, and then but we also know that these grand structural theories of modernization being one of them was a very, very powerful and overarching conceptual framework within which work of all disciplines, including anthropology, was located. Right. Early work was also influenced by historical structuralist and political economy frameworks in anthropology, right? And so what do we mean by historical structuralist approaches? So you had, you look at migration from the frame or the context of a global economy where you have core and periphery relations of development and underdevelopment. So within historical structuralist frameworks, there are two very important theories. One is the dependency theory by Alexander Frank, and the second is the world system theory by Immanuel Wallerstein, right? So the dependency theory rejects the view that people of less developed countries are responsible for the failure of their societies to develop. So what Alexander Frank does is that he suggests that there's been a lack of development because Western nations have deliberately underdeveloped them. So you have the idea of a core and you have the idea of a periphery, and Alexander Frank argues that the relationship between core regions and peripheral regions is very unequal, and that is a structural problem. When we come to the world systems theory, the world system theory is very similar. It looks at the world as from the framework of in a global framework, right? And developed by Wallerstein, it's an approach to looking at world history and social change that suggests that there is a world economic system in which some countries benefit while others are exploited, right? And Wallerstein goes on to say that we have a global capitalist system which is the core of exploitation, and it is because of this global capitalist system that various relationships of dependency exist, right? And so within this, you have a concept of the international division of labor, and you have concepts of the internationalization of the proletariat, right? So within anthropology, there is a focus on studying labor, there's a focus on studying labor processes, and then how is it that the working class, how is it that the labor process works in the working class? That is also, and the international working class, that is also one of the important components of study in anthropology, right? So, like we discussed earlier, anthropologists are very interested in the lived experience of migrant workers, right? So when you're studying the lived experience of migrant workers, your unit of analysis is the individual, right? Now, the world system theory and dependency theory, right, the historical structuralist frameworks, they are in these frameworks, we're not able to study the individual. We're looking at macro structures. We're looking at the global market, right? So the way national and international economic policies have disrupted, displaced, or even attracted local population, thereby generating particular migration stream, that's what the world system theory, that's what structural theories are able to tell us, right? And more empirically, if you want to imagine this, then, you know, you have an adverse incorporation of labor in some very specific migration streams, right? That could be a point of study of the world system theory or dependency theory. Anthropologists are also very interested in culture, right? The culture of migration, and so the history and socio-cultural dimensions of the sending community is one major area of study in anthropology. And as Massey and his colleague explain, migration becomes deeply ingrained onto the repertoire of people's behavior, and values associated with migration become a part of the community's values. Now, the culture of migration is operationalized by Cohen in the context of Oaxacans in southern Mexico, and where, you know, he explains that migration is pervasive. It occurs throughout the region and has a historical presence that dates to the first half of the 20th century, and that the decision to migrate is one that people make as a part of their everyday experiences. And the decision to migrate is accepted by most Oaxacans as one path towards economic well-being. So you can see how migration in many social contexts is a fact of life, it's a norm of life, and it's a, apart from being an economic concept, it's also a socio-cultural concept, right? and it is embedded in the local values of that society. And so therefore therefore cultures of migration are pervasive. They differ in various societies, but in some societies they're more pervasive than other. And then one way to approach, is one way to approach this also to interrogate the meanings, the relationship between sending and receiving societies. And this is something that we specifically look at through the perspective of transnationalism that we are going to discuss next. So transnationalism is a fundamental concept in migration studies, and anthropologists have studied it the best. So what do we mean by transnationalism? So the first thing is that it sort of, the study of transnationalism also reflects a general move in anthropology away from bounded units of analysis and local community studies. So what you have is, transnationalism then is conceived as social action in a multi-dimensional global space with unbounded, often discontinuous and interpenetrating subspaces. So therefore, it links with postmodern theory, feminist theory, and the idea is to theorize space and place in new ways. So we have diaspora studies which are interested in beyond people living outside their homelands, right? So the traveling term in changing global conditions. So then the analytical utility of frame and host interesting questions about political and economic space within which diasporic communities operate, right? So within transnationalism and within diaspora studies, anthropologists specifically look at the diasporic family, ethnic networks, what is the subjective meaning of displacement. There's also research on the trail of collective memories, on diaspora and homeland relations, as well as diaspora in cyberspace. So what transnationalism really does is it offers an alternative to and a critique of earlier manifestations of articulation theory, right? And so it generates new ideas about representation, incorporation of immigrants who are involved in the area of nation building of more than one state. So you have diaspora which are involved in nation building of the host state as well as from the societies where they come, right? And so therefore, national identities are not only blurred, but they're also negotiated or constructed. Then you have transnational professionals, professionals who work in multiple spaces across multiple times, and social networks also play a huge role in this. And you can go back to our lecture specifically on transnationalism in migration, on social networks in migration, to kind of draw more between the connections between these. The other very important part in anthropology is the social organization of migration, so which has to do with kinship networks and gender. So as you know, the anthropologist generally locates transnational processes within the lives of individuals, within the lives of families, right? And particularly in the personal, economic and social connections that articulate the world they have left with the world they have entered. And so the roots of this discipline, the roots of the anthropological discipline, Caroline Brettell reminds us, have been in the study of kinship and social organization. So then it's only natural that these roots are also at the core of migration research, right? So social networks are a tool of research, they're a method of analysis, but they're also so much more than that. And theories about how social relationships are forged, how systems are constructed, at the foundation, they're at the foundation of network analysis, right? And so therefore, you have studies on network-mediated kinship, friendship, chain migration, all of which are very important in migration empirically and from the perspective of anthropology. Right. So now what do we mean by social networks, right? So within migration, social networks are a very important area of research. We have a separate lecture specifically devoted to social network. But the idea is that migration network must be conceived as facilitating rather than encapsulating, as permeable, expanding and fluid rather than as correlating with a metaphor or a rigid and bounded structure, right? So networks can be self-perpetuating. Every new migrant reduces the cost of subsequent migration for the next set of migrants, and so therefore they act as bridgeheads, right? We looked at modernization and dependency theories earlier, and we saw how they might be in tension with individual agency and so on and so forth. So similarly, you have tensions in theories of network mediated migration versus rational choice migration, right? And these are like, tensions between disciplines. Network mediated migration is something which is dominant in sociology and anthropology, highlighting how social connections and social networks lead to migration. Whereas on the other hand, economists generally take a rational choice, cost-benefit method of analysis, which can often be in tension with networks, because you see, you can also, even if the cost-benefit doesn't really work out to your advantage, but you can still migrate, and people still migrate because of social networks, right? So, so this is normal. These are disciplinary tensions. Then the other important aspect is that in both transnationalism and social networks, the unit of analysis has shifted to the household. Now, why is this important? This is fundamentally important because typically if the unit of analysis is the individual, then networks are far more easily understood. But the household is also known as a black box. What goes on within the household? What are the relationships between people in the household? How does power play a role in deciding who migrates and who doesn't migrate? So therefore, the fundamental point being that a household is a significant unit of analysis which is often not studied. It's not studied very well. It's difficult to study the household. And that's something which anthropologists can do because they're interested in individuals, how individuals relate to one another. So therefore, the unit of analysis also has shifted to the household, which is complex, and anthropology is best suited to kind of unpack the household, and especially in the areas of transnationalism and social networks. The other thing which has emerged is that, of course, it's important. Social and cultural variables are very important with economic variables. And social networks and households simultaneously mediate macrostructural changes, facilitate migration response to these changes, and perpetuate migration as a self-sustaining social process. Right. Now, within social networks, the role of networks in settlement and adaptation is also very important. Social networks are particularly important in the context of undocumented migrants, and of course, there's a whole literature on women, female networks, which has been ignored for much of the 20th century because women are generally seen as dependent, passive followers, or they are seen as those who are waiting or those who have been left behind in the countryside. But increasingly, we have literature on female migration, on the feminization of migration. Now, this is something we deal with in the gender and migration section. But the point here being that female networks are different from male networks, and they are also very, very important in the academic study of migration, and anthropology focuses quite a bit on female networks, right? So then we can see clearly that there are some very key areas of research in anthropology that overlap with sociology. For instance, changes in family and kinship patterns, that's one area. Labor force participation of immigrant women or migrant women, the impact of salaried employment on domestic roles and domestic powers, work-life balance, the immigration experience of women vis-a-vis their own men, so gendered immigrant experiences, transnational parenting, sex trafficking. So in all of these areas, there is significant overlap between anthropology and sociology. Now, how does anthropology theorize migration, ethnicity, identity, right? And as Kearney reminds us, at the heart of current anthropological concerns with transnationalism, identity politics, migration, and human rights, there is a persistent resurgence or de novo emergence of ethnicity at a time when, according to modernization theory, it was to have been attenuated by robust nation states. So now you see, the point that we're trying to make here is that ethnicity is important, culture is important, ethnicity is important, and these don't disappear. Over time, there's been a growing interest in identity and ethnicity to the implosion of culture, right? And ethnicity has been the core of anthropology, and there have been three very distinct approaches to study ethnicity. So the first has been the primordialist approach. This approach has largely prevailed until the 1960s, and the primordial approach is one where ethnic identity is the result of deep-rooted attachments to a group and culture, right? Now the other two approaches are instrumentalist and situational, and these two approaches are quite important for migration studies. The instrumentalist approach focuses on ethnicity as a political strategy that is pursued for pragmatic interests. On the other hand, the situational approach emphasizes the fluidity and contingency of ethnic identity, which is constructed in specific historical and social contexts. Right. So now migration brings different populations together and creates boundaries, right? And so ethnicity is not primarily then conceived as a matter of relations between predefined fixed groups, but it's rather a process of constituting and reconfiguring groups by defining the boundaries between them, as Wimmer explains. So therefore, ethnicity is a strategic response. It can be invoked in particular situations. And so Britell uses the examples of immigrants abroad, right, specifically focusing on race and ethnic identity. And she gives the example of Indian immigrants. And so, you know, like many Indian immigrants and their children are there in across the world, in the US, in UK. And so in the US specifically, when Indians migrate to the US, they think of themselves as Indians living abroad. And then they begin to envision themselves as Americans. But very quickly they realize that the US society is divided along ethnic lines, along racial lines, right? So then a great many Indian immigrants then conclude that it's preferable to develop an ethnic group identity than to accept a racial categorization, right? So this is something that, you know, Britell draws on the work of Lesigier. And so you have this whole, how is it that race and ethnicity intersect, and what identity do people take, what identity do people prefer? This is again an important area of research, right? Similarly, you have Caribbean and Haitian immigrants who construct their identity in relation or in contrast to African Americans in the US, right? Similarly, you have Greeks and Turks who are at war at home with friends in Germany. Then you have the case of Sikhs in the UK now, who sort of grapple with both caste and class identities, right? So the idea, you know, anthropology brings you the idea that there are processual community building aspects of identity rather than fixed or external markers, right? And so therefore, immigrants are constantly negotiating their ethnic identities, and of course ethnic identity become more apparent among diasporic people, and they're constantly negotiating and renegotiating their ethnic identity, which is subject to continued contestation. Now, while we're theorizing ethnicity and identity, material cultures are also very important, right? So you have symbols or ethnic markers around which ethnic identity is constructed, it's formulated. You have community activities, including religious activities, which become an expression of immigrants' ethnic identity, right? So, like for instance, you have symbols, like you have Islamic dress, which is worn in a context of, say, Europe, then that becomes a symbol or an ethnic marker. Similarly, you have spaces, markets such as Little Italy, Chinatown in Western cities. These are also symbols and ethnic markers, right? And of course, you know, religion, ethno-religious activity, these are all very, very prominent markers of identity abroad than at home. So, Bretel also uses, she gives the example of Canada, you know, in where you have, Canada is a multicultural society, and then your religious activities can overlap with ethnicity, right? So, for instance, langar in a Sikh community will become an ethno-religious activity, right? Similarly, you have Korean churches in the US where you have Americanization and simultaneously the preservation of Korean identity and culture, right? So these are all instances of diasporic nationalism, where religion, ethnicity, nation states all intersect with one another, right? There's another thing that I would like to draw your attention to, and that's the concept of social remittances. So we're all aware of the concept of economic remittances. Now, social remittances is a term which is coined by Peggy Levitt, right? And so Levitt says, and you know, by social remittances, it is meant the ideas, practices, identities, and social capital that flow from receiving to sending country communities, right? Now, this could be religious tradition in the context of transnationalism and so on. We now come to the concept of citizenship and belonging, which is again very closely linked with inclusion and exclusion in destination society, right? Now, what do we mean by citizenship and belonging, right? So, of course, this has to do with claims of identity, intimacy, inclusion within and across national boundaries, right? And this emerges as a very important topic in a context where, in the context of transnationalism, where you have transnational arrangements by ordinary migrants, their family and friends, both undermined by political dominance and the cultural authority of the state. Then you have Michel Laguerre, who's coined the term diasporic citizenship. What do we mean by diasporic citizenship? Diasporic citizenship is when you have the subjective experience of belonging to two nation states. You could be the citizen of one legally, and this is different from legal citizenship. You know, when you, and there are so many millions and millions of people who belong, who have a feeling of belonging of two nation states separately, that is diasporic citizenship. Similarly, Aiwa Ong has introduced the concept of flexible citizenship. Now, flexible citizenship relates to a particular kind of a technocrat and professional class that is constantly moving from one place to the other, both circumventing and benefiting from different nation states, and they are able to select different sites for investment, for work, and family relocation. So, citizenship really, you know, is then the relationship between the individual and the state, and in an anthropological frame, it's inflected by identity, social positioning, cultural assumptions, institutional practices, and a sense of belonging. Now, cultural citizenship is a very, very important component of migration studies and anthropology, and studies here have taken two different distinct forms, right? One set of studies relate to immigrant agency. whereas the other set of studies largely focus on governmentality and subject making, right? So now the right to be different in terms of race, ethnicity, or native language with respect to the norms of the dominant national community without compromising on one's right to belong in the sense of participating in the nation state's democratic processes, right? And so it also then accommodates multicultural conceptions of political belonging. How is it that people practice citizenship in their daily lives, and what are the participatory forms of citizenship which very often involves strategic action by immigrants, which may be legal, may not be legal, right? So cultural citizenship therefore offers a model, for instance, empirically to understand how Mexican migrants in the US can be recognized as legitimate political subjects claiming rights for themselves and their children based on their economic and cultural contribution regardless of their official status. So you see, cultural citizenship goes beyond the laws of nation states, and it's actually rooted in the everyday anthropology of life. The other fundamental topic that anthropologists have taken up is the state theory and multiculturalism, right? Here, anthropology broadly focuses on what has been the impact of the state and the law on the lives of immigrants. This could be related to policing the border, production of boundaries, governmentality, discipline, surveillance, unequal power relations, illegality, asylum seeking, deportation. So these broad areas are related to the state, city, surveillance, and multiculturalism is something that anthropologists have taken up in migration study. Now, you look at the quote in the middle of the screen, right? Now, this is Natalie Puetz has very poignantly written this in the context of Somalian citizens deported from the US and Canada after 9/11. And she writes, and I quote, "The deportee body is doubly stigmatized, polluted and polluting, both in the host society and at home. Simply put, deportable bodies exclude the danger of their transnational states, and as aliens they are all the more outcast. Similarly, deported bodies are suspected of carrying with them the pollution contracted abroad, while also remaining anomalies at home. Their forced return subverting the fetishized immigration success story." So you see how anthropology then has the scope to nuance this example of deportation, nuance this example of border making and the impacts of border making. And then, so Willen goes on to argue that illegality influences how migrants think about and experience time, space, and their bodies in ways that fundamentally structure their basic sense of self. In the study of the state theory and multiculturalism, documents are also very important, right? Documents that define the lives of unregulated immigrant bodies, certificates that regimes of truth, subjectification, subjection. Application for asylum also becomes an important part here. Those seeking political asylum subject themselves to state surveillance. Negative outcome is that they indirectly cause their own expulsion by coming forward in the first place. Then you also have moral and cultural relativism, the whole debate of assimilation versus multiculturalism, right? So, for instance, you know, in 2004, the law banned headscarf in public schools in France, right? The idea was that they should promote assimilation rather than multiculturalism. Now, the French Republic and French identity are based on secularism and communalism, right? So the media then played a role in defining what kind of a Muslim is deemed acceptable in the country. Now in Britain, on the other hand, there was no such ban. Though there was opposition from many quarters, there was no such ban. So therefore, it was more multicultural. It resisted the headscarf ban, right? So therefore, we also know then, you know, that there are political agendas of the multicultural project, right? Similarly, Caroline Brettel uses the example of Oniwekan's work, right? And so Oniwekan argues that the excessive tolerance for difference has resulted in a generous betrayal of immigrants, where cultures become more like race. It's a concept that subverts human rights, especially for women and children. So then interesting areas of research, therefore, through the anthropological lens have been, for second generation immigrants, what is their identity? Is it from where they come, or is it to the societies where they are, right? So the tension between home and host identity for first, second generation immigrants, then the whole example of honor killings that take place in certain ethnic groups in developed societies, that also tells us a lot about transnationalism, right? And so the fundamental question then is about how to manage diversity. Now in recent years, anthropologists have turned to the diversity cities have to offer. So some of the areas of research have been how migrants actively contribute to the restructuring and repositioning of either their cities of settlement or to those which they are transnationally connected, right? Similarly, migrants are agents and subjects of global processes that reposition locality. So the city scale approach, it offers us a framework to understand how is it that the global and the local intersect and interact, and what is the role and experiences of migrants in these processes, right? And there's a lot of research around migrants' commitment to the city, right? And then Brettel asked, but what about the city's commitment to the migrant? Isn't that, or shouldn't that also be an important area of research? So to sum up, in this lecture, we started with the various typologies and meanings of migrants and migration. And then how is it that this is articulated theoretically from the micro to the macro, from the local to the global, from here to there. We then went on to the social organization of migration, kinship, networks, and gender, which are very, very important topics in anthropology and therefore in the anthropology of migration. Then we specifically looked at ethnicity and identity, after which we focused on citizenship and belonging, covering themes of inclusion and exclusion. And in the end, we spoke about the state, city, and multiculturalism. So the idea of this lecture was to give you a broad overview of the discipline of anthropology and how the anthropology theorizes migration. And the broad reading for this has been Caroline Brettel's chapter theorizing migration anthropology in the book that she has co-edited with Holyfield, Migration Theory, Talking Across Disciplines. I hope you found the talk useful. Thank you very much.